Inside the South African courtroom, tension is at its peak. Judges have now reserved judgment in the dramatic battle over Edgar Lungu's burial. On one side, the widow demands her rights. On the other, the state insists on control. But with no final verdict yet, one burning question remains. Who will win this courtroom showdown? The answer could change Zambia's politics forever. Stay tuned, because the outcome may shock you. The Edgar Lungu burial case has taken another shocking twist as the court has reserved judgment. This means the judges are carefully weighing the arguments, but the battle between Lungu's widow and the state is far from over. In this video, we break down why the judgment was reserved, the key arguments from both sides, what this means for Lungu's burial rights, the political implications for Zambia and Africa. This is not just a family dispute, it's a courtroom drama with national consequences. Subscribe to InspirAfrica Official for exclusive analysis on Zambia, Africa, and global politics. The widow's cry. The courtroom fell silent as Esther Lungu walked in, draped in black, her face veiled in grief. Once the First Lady of Zambia, she now stood as a widow, not with the protection of power, but with the vulnerability of loss. For many, it was a haunting image, a woman who had lived in the presidential palace, now standing before judges, begging for the right to bury her husband. Her voice, though soft, carried weight. She argued not as a politician's wife, but as a widow demanding dignity. "Let him rest," her lawyers echoed. The plea was simple, human, yet the stakes were anything but. Behind her tears, however, questions lingered. Was this truly about grief, or was there more at play? Critics whispered that Esther's courtroom presence was not just about love and loss. Some suspected she was protecting something bigger, Lungu's legacy, his fortune, and perhaps even secrets buried with him. For her supporters, none of that mattered. They saw a woman stripped of titles, left only with sorrow, fighting a cold and unfeeling system. Crowds outside carried placards reading, "Give him to his people," and "Respect the widow." To them, Esther's pain reflected their own, the ache of a nation mourning a leader, no matter his faults. But the state saw things differently. To them, this was no ordinary widow. This was a woman standing at the crossroads of politics and justice. A burial wasn't just closure, it was a final act that could either silence questions forever or leave them unresolved. And so, the widow's cry echoed through the courtroom. Part grief, part defiance, part mystery. Was she simply a mourning wife, or the last guardian of a legacy too controversial to bury? One thing was clear, Esther Lungu had entered the battlefield. And she was not leaving quietly. The state strikes back. If Esther Lungu entered the courtroom with grief, the state entered with power. Their lawyers stood tall, armed not with tears, but with statutes, precedents, and an unshakable message. This was not about emotion, this was about law. The state's opening arguments cut like a blade. They insisted that Edgar Lungu was not just a husband or a father, but a former head of state whose legacy carried shadows too heavy to ignore. They reminded the court that Lungu's final days were clouded in questions. Foreign passports, unexplained assets, and whispers of networks that stretched far beyond Zambia's borders. Could such a man be buried without accountability? To the state, the answer was clear, no. They painted the picture of a government standing firm against what they described as manipulation. Allowing a quiet burial, they argued, would erase critical questions of justice. "The soil cannot cover the truth," one lawyer declared, his voice echoing through the chamber. Not yet. But this stance was not without risk. Outside the courtroom, some citizens accused the state of cruelty, of weaponizing grief to score political points. Placards reading, "Justice delayed is burial denied," clashed with others demanding, "No burial without truth." Inside, however, the state stood unflinching. They spoke not just to the judges, but to history, positioning themselves as guardians of law and sovereignty. This was about more than one coffin. It was about whether Zambia would bend under pressure or hold firm against sentiment. For Esther, it was a crushing counterattack. Her tears had met the cold face of law, and suddenly the battle lines were drawn sharper than ever. In that moment, it became clear, the courtroom was no longer a place of mourning. It was an arena of war. Secrets beneath the coffin. Beneath the polished wood of Edgar Lungu's coffin lies more than a body. It lies questions, dangerous questions, that have haunted Zambia since the day his death was announced. Whispers swirl of hidden fortunes, stashed away in secret accounts abroad. Some claim millions were siphoned out of Zambia during his years in office, money that vanished into South Africa, Dubai, and beyond. Others point to the rumors of a Zimbabwean passport found among his belongings, a discovery that raised eyebrows and fueled speculation. Why would a Zambian president hold foreign documents? What was he preparing for? The coffin, in many ways, has become a vault. A vault that, once buried, may lock away truths the state is desperate to uncover. Lawyers argue that the answers to corruption, power struggles, and international deals might never see the light of day if the burial is rushed. Supporters of Lungu dismiss this as political theater. To them, dragging his coffin through courtrooms is nothing more than humiliation for a man who once led the nation. They insist the so-called secrets are fabrications, designed to tarnish his memory and punish his widow. But the whispers refuse to fade. Each day the coffin waits, new rumors surface, of offshore accounts, of untraceable wealth, of promises made to foreign powers. To some, it feels as though the body itself is on trial. And so, the coffin has become more than a symbol of grief. It is now a stage prop in a larger story, a story of power, betrayal, and unfinished business. What exactly lies beneath the coffin? A man's remains, or the final pieces of a puzzle too dangerous to solve? Until judgment is given, no one will truly know. Judges under fire. In the heart of the courtroom, all eyes turned not to the widow, nor the state lawyers, but to the judges. For they now carried a burden heavier than the coffin itself, the burden of deciding where history would rest. From the very start, the pressure was immense. Lawyers shouted across the chamber, their arguments laced with both law and emotion. One moment, Esther's legal team accused the state of cruelty, of denying a family its right to mourn. The next, the state fired back, warning that justice could not be buried under sympathy. The judges sat between fire and water, their faces unreadable, their silence louder than any gavel strike. But outside the courtroom, the storm raged hotter. Newspapers accused the judges of bias. Social media exploded with anger, some calling them puppets of the government, others demanding they resist the widow's emotional sway. Placards outside screamed, "Judges protect the truth," while others warned, "Don't play politics with death." Even within the legal fraternity, whispers grew louder. Some lawyers feared that whichever way the judges ruled, Zambia's judiciary would never be the same. To rule in favor of the widow would be seen as weakness, bending to sentiment. To rule with the state would be painted as cold, even inhumane. And so, the judges became the story. Their robes, once symbols of neutrality, now looked like targets. The pressure from the public, the government, and even foreign eyes weighed on every decision they delayed. In the end, the judges chose silence, reserving their ruling, postponing their verdict, leaving the coffin in limbo. For some, this was caution. For others, it was cowardice. But one thing was certain, the judges were no longer just arbiters of law. They had become actors in a drama that would decide not only a burial, but the very soul of Zambia's justice. A nation divided. Outside the courtroom, Zambia itself was split in two. On one side, crowds gathered with candles, singing hymns, praying for Edgar Lungu's soul and demanding that his body be laid to rest. For them, this was not about politics, but about dignity, the universal right of every human being to be buried. On the other side stood angry protesters, their chants sharp, their placards clear, "No burial without justice." To them, Edgar Lungu was not just a former president. He was a symbol of unanswered corruption, a man who left behind more questions than answers. To bury him now, they argued, would be to bury the truth itself. This division spilled into homes, churches, and even parliament. Families argued over dinner tables. Pastors preached fiery sermons, some calling for forgiveness, others demanding accountability. The media amplified it all, turning the burial dispute into a national debate that touched every Zambian heart. Even the diaspora joined in. From Johannesburg to London, from Washington to Sydney, Zambians abroad staged demonstrations, waving flags and shouting slogans that revealed the same fracture lines: honor the man or expose his legacy. For the nation, it felt like reliving the divisions of his presidency. Under Lungu, Zambia had already been torn between loyalty and disillusionment. Now, even in death, he seemed to divide the land he once ruled. And in this division, ordinary Zambians felt the weight most. Farmers in the fields, miners underground, traders in Lusaka's markets, all carried opinions, all carried pain. For them, this was more than a courtroom case. It was a question of who they were as a nation. A people who forgive and move forward, or a people who demand justice, no matter how heavy the cost. In the streets, the chants grew louder. The nation was no longer just watching a court case. It was living in the middle of it. The widow or the general. Edgar Lungu entered the courtroom each day draped in black, the picture of grief. But behind the mourning veil, a new image began to form, that of a strategist, a fighter, perhaps even a general. To her supporters, she was a widow stripped of her home, her husband, and her peace. They saw her tears as genuine, her presence as a painful duty to the man she loved. Crowds chanted her name outside, women in particular rallying to her side, saying she carried the pain of every Zambian widow. But to her critics, Esther was no mere mourner. They argued she was using grief as a weapon, turning the courtroom into a political stage. Her speeches were polished, her appearances calculated. Each time the cameras turned to her, she seemed to embody not just a wife, but a leader, defiant, unbroken, determined. Whispers grew louder. Was she preparing to step into the political arena herself? After all, Zambia had seen powerful widows before, women who carried their husbands' legacies into politics, and in some cases, into office. Could Esther be next? Her courtroom battle seemed to reinforce the suspicion. She fought not only for burial rights but for something larger, the narrative of who Edgar Lungu was and what he left behind. In doing so, she positioned herself as the custodian of his legacy, the keeper of the story, the defender of his honor. To some, this made her a heroine. To others, it made her dangerous. A widow transformed into a general is not to be underestimated. And so, the question echoed across Zambia. Who was Esther Lungu in this battle? A grieving wife seeking closure? Or a rising political figure sharpening her weapons under the cloak of mourning? Only time, and the final judgment, would reveal the answer. The shadows of power. Behind the polished speeches and legal arguments, there were forces moving in the shadows, unseen, unspoken, but unmistakably powerful. From the start, it became clear that this burial case was never just about where Edgar Lungu's body would rest. It was about influence, control, and the lingering fingerprints of power. Inside Zambia, whispers pointed to the corridors of State House. Advisors, ministers, and party strategists were said to be weighing in, not openly, but through back channels. Decisions that appeared purely legal carried political undertones, as though every motion in court was a chess piece moved by unseen hands. Beyond Zambia's borders, South Africa's government loomed quietly over the proceedings. After all, Lungu had died on their soil. Their courts, their laws, and their reputation were at stake. For Pretoria, the case was about sovereignty and order. For Lusaka, it was about symbolism and control. And in between stood the Lungu family, caught in a storm larger than themselves. But there were other shadows too. Former allies of Lungu, generals, business tycoons, even foreign investors, had much to lose depending on the outcome. If the state gained full control of the burial, their connection to the former president might fade into silence. If Esther prevailed, those ties could be revived, reshaped, or even weaponized. Courtroom transcripts revealed little of these hidden battles. The real war was not fought in legal language but in whispered phone calls, private meetings, and sudden shifts of allegiance. Every delay in judgment, every reserved ruling, seemed to carry the weight of invisible negotiations. And so, as Zambia waited for the verdict, one truth grew clearer by the day. The courtroom lights may have illuminated the lawyers, the widow, and the judges, but the real power players remained in the dark, pulling strings from the shadows. The question was no longer who would win the case, but whose hand was guiding the victory from behind the curtain. The verdict that never came. The nation waited. Families gathered around radios, televisions, and phones, anticipating the moment when the judges would speak. A verdict was expected, a decision that would finally end the uncertainty over Edgar Lungu's final resting place. But instead, silence. Judgment reserved. Two words that echoed louder than any ruling. For some, it felt like a cruel twist of fate. How could a case that had consumed headlines, divided families, and captured the world's attention end without closure? For others, it was a calculated move, a way for the court to delay a decision that could ignite fire on either side. The absence of a verdict left more questions than answers. Was the judiciary truly caught between two equal claims, the state's right to control a former president's legacy and the widow's right to decide where her husband should rest? Or was the delay itself a strategy, a way to buy time while political storms calmed in the background? In the streets of Lusaka, frustration turned to anger. Supporters of Edgar Lungu cried foul, insisting the system was rigged against her. Government allies countered that the judiciary was simply exercising caution, aware of the dangerous precedent the ruling might set. International observers weighed in, too. Human rights groups argued the delay violated the family's dignity, while others saw it as proof that Zambia's courts were, at least in part, resisting political pressure. But one thing was undeniable: the uncertainty deepened the mystery. Every day without a verdict added fuel to speculation. Who was really holding the pen behind the judgment? And why was the truth being postponed? In the end, the burial case became less about Edgar Lungu himself and more about Zambia's future. The unresolved verdict stood as a haunting reminder. Sometimes, in politics and in life, silence can be louder than words. The courtroom lights dimmed. The widow walked out, still waiting. The state held its position, and the people of Zambia were left with one final, unsettling question. Would the judgment ever truly come?